equality cannot be attained through inequality. Now, the reason Māori seats were created was to give Māori more representation in Parliament, which is left-wing affirmative action by definition. And affirmative action of any kind always gives certain people preferential treatment over others. That is discrimination. That is inequality.
So, I'm watching Terry Opines on YouTube, right? And he starts talking about the Māori electorates. And so, in his opinion, he's saying that they were designed to give Māori greater representation. Now, one of the things when people make an argument against the Māori electorates is they never tell you about the history of how they started. Now, he's just gone off on some vague explanation that the Māori electorates were created to give Māori greater representation, which is actually just disinformation. How they were actually created was, in the 1870s, the New Zealand Wars just happened. There was a parliament in New Zealand, and it was made up of approximately 70 British MPs. All these people were not born in New Zealand. They were British immigrants born in the United Kingdom, and they come in here and set up a parliament, and they deliberately excluded Māori participation. So Sir George Grey comes along, and he decides, well, you know, we can't really call this a democracy if we have excluded 3/4 of the New Zealand population, which were Māori. So British were a minority in New Zealand, and they made up approximately 70 MPs that they could vote for. So Grey decides to limit Māori representation and offer 4 members of Parliament's roles to Māori, who were made up 3/4 of the New Zealand population. So when Terry Opines starts to tell you that it's to give Māori greater representation, it's the exact opposite. It's to limit Māori representation within the democracy. So what Grey does is he goes and cherry picks 4 MPs that we consider within Māoridom to be kupapa, which is a traitor towards the Crown Forces. So these were officers from the New Zealand Armed Constabulary that had fought for the British during the New Zealand Wars. These weren't people who Māoridom would have chosen. So these 4 MPs, they get into Parliament, they get voted in, there's no other options, no one else is allowed to put their candidacy forward. It's entirely rigged. And so we go on for probably about another 100 years underrepresented Māori in the Māori electorates. So it was to limit a Māori voice in the New Zealand Parliament. And so when Terry comes out and says, like, that is discrimination, the Māori electorates, yeah, it was, to advance Pākehā privilege. It's British New Zealanders that were endowing themselves with privilege. They were taking control of the New Zealand government and not allowing Māori participation. And when they finally did, it was only tokenism. So people like Terry, who like to make up tall stories and advocate against the Māori electorates, they won't tell you the full story. They'll just gloss over it and say, oh, you know, it was to give Māori greater representation. No, it wasn't. It was to limit Māori representation. I guess he's right in a way, going from no representation with 70 British immigrants to having 4 Māori MPs, actual real New Zealanders that were born in New Zealand, to be representatives in the New Zealand Parliament. I guess that's something. That's greater representation than nothing. But the way Terry's portrayed it, that it's race-based privilege, when in reality, the race-based privilege has always been for British New Zealanders, and that continues today.